Okay, so it is my real pleasure to welcome Jay Christopher King onto the podcast. Jay, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. How are you doing?
Great. Thank you so much for having me. I love your show, and so it's a real honor to be here today.
Thank you very much. Um, that's amazing to hear for me. Thank you, Jay. Now, look, obviously, where we're going to begin in an interview like this is that I'm going to ask you to to kind of introduce yourself if you could, and maybe speak about the group that you set up, the Experiencer group. You could please share.
Oh, sure. So about my name's Jay Christopher King, as you said. I co-founded the Experiencer Group at the beginning of last year. The Experiencer Group is a private community and member site dedicated to support, curiosity, and community for people who've had anomalous events of all kinds. So that could be UAP, UFOs, that could be near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, astral projection, cryptids. There are so many different modalities that clairaudience, precognitions, psi experiences. There are so many different modalities and formats. And I think that there's a growing awareness among many experiencers and among many anomalous researchers that there's a lot more kind of overlap between these different modalities than people kind of wanted to admit for a long time. And
Mm,
we'd always had these kinds of pockets of paranormal researchers that were, more based in the land of hauntings or more based in the land of ufology. And for whatever reason, a lot of these people wouldn't touch these other communities for fear of illegitimacy or something like that, or looking too strange, which is ironic, of course, given the situation of researching any of these topics to begin with, and in terms of like the stigmatized culture that we had experienced for decades, right? Centuries.
yeah.
And so Stuart Davis, Kirsten Blackburn, and I co-founded the Experiencer Group. The opening day for a select group of founding members was February 1st of 2021. Before that, during the pandemic, I'd been hosting and co-hosting private Zoom support groups for other experiencers since the early days of the pandemic.
Uh,
Some people took up bread making during the pandemic, and some people took up, basket weaving, and I took up support groups for experiencers, and I kind of never looked back since then.
yeah. And so, do you find that there's a kind of, and it sounds as if you encourage discussion between these different groups. And I imagine what might happen is that, sorry, different experiences within the same group. And I imagine what might happen is that things get triggered in terms of, one person would come to something, think to the group thinking, I've had a UFO experience as an example, but then maybe, things get triggered so they think, oh, actually, that there is something else that happens, which then, you know, reminds me of the thing that someone else is talking about.
That's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. It happens very, very often. We continue to hold weekly support meetings on top of other types of meetings that we primarily hold by Zoom. And we also have a custom social media interface where people can post and reply to each other, direct messaging, all that kind of stuff. So we kind of have our own custom built social media site within there. And then we host weekly groups, both the support meetings, like a book group, a dream study group, current events group, all sorts of different ways, different excuses for experiencers to be able to talk with each other.
Yeah.
And yes, it's very often the case that someone will come in and it's often the case that a new member, there are often people that don't feel that they can really talk about this just out in the open on Facebook or out in the open on Instagram, or even just in their interpersonal circle in IRL, in real life, right?
Yeah.
And because, maybe there are a lot of people that have very professional, business situations, entrepreneurs. There's doctors, there's psychiatrists. There's a lot of people that have the kinds of jobs that, often there's a lot of stigma attached to having strange beliefs or strange experiences with, right? And so those are often some of the kind of first tier of people that will be coming in the door in the experiencer group. And then there's a lot of other folks too. But one of those groups of folks will be people that have experienced multiple modalities of anomalous experience and have just kind of lived in secret about it because they thought it was too strange to have seen, say, what they perceived as a ghost and what they perceived as a non-human entity, or that they'd, say, experienced precognitive dreams within days of seeing a UFO. And as we get together as a community and as we look at the research and as we start to compare notes, we realize that that's more common. It's
Yeah.
more common for an experiencer to have more than one modality and more than one experience than it even really is for someone to have one single experience. In fact, when we look at the numbers, at least amongst our community, what we see is that it's actually a very, very small chance that somebody just has the one experience that lasts a minute or two and that's it, right?
That's really
Um,
interesting. Yeah.
yeah. And so, yes, it's often the case that as we have these conversations, people say, yeah, there was that time that I saw the UFO and the other time that this happened, but that was about it. And then as people talk, people say, well, there was that one time and where I foresaw my aunt's death or so, some like it's something incredibly specific,
Yeah.
and for whatever reason, you know our I think our minds in many ways, often in common culture especially, but maybe as a protective mechanism, we forget things that are traumatic, right? And we also, and along those lines, that's very established within psychological and therapeutic frameworks that people that have traumatic childhoods often have very few memories from childhood because of their brain kind of like over recycling those elements and trying to get clear of those memories. And it's also often the case from what we've seen that it seems that memories that don't quite conform to the conventional understanding of reality also often get kind of put into the mental recycling bin by people. And sometimes those are retrievable, and sometimes they maybe aren't so retrievable. And we don't have clear answers about what that entirely means, but we certainly have seen many situations where somebody has a eureka moment within the experiencer group and remembers just the most amazing situation that they hadn't recalled for years or maybe even decades.
Yeah. And do you find, and maybe also do you track um, people talking about their families and phenomena experienced by mothers or brothers? One of the reasons why I ask this is because I've recently met somebody that I'm going to speak to on the podcast hopefully soon, who uh, had essentially grew up in a haunted house, and I just like talking about it, and I said, "What about UFOs?" You know, you never know, unless you ask. And I'm like totally fine with asking people, and people would know that. And the number of times I've said this before in the podcast, the number of people, I mean, literally everybody I've spoken to about have either had an experience themselves or somebody that they trust, like totally trust, they know is not mucking them around, has had an experience. And that goes so much to kind of, the weight of the stigma out there. And I was speaking the other day to Dad Smith, and I said, imagine a world where there was no stigma in these topics. Incredible. Um, but anyway, so she said, well, not me, but my brother. a brother, and so they've got this. She had these extraordinary, you know, haunted house experiences, and the whole family did because they're all living in the house. And then just recently, the brother has had something happen in terms of UFOs. And do you find that? I'm not sure if you kind of, well, I suppose obviously some people will talk about their folks and others won't within the groups. But is it something you've noticed?
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, it's such a who loves a neologism. Stuart Davis, did I freeze?
You did freeze, yeah. Can I just oh no, there's no counter to this. Is there?
Okay.
Sorry, yeah, is it okay?
Yeah, we're back.
Sorry, you totally froze. Um,
Should I turn off my video or
Not
or I
sure.
can keep going like this?
We could try. Should we try that? Does that make a
We could.
difference?
It often makes a difference, but I mean, I like being able to physically respond to
No, I
folks,
know it's
but
much better, isn't it, with the video?
yeah,
Let's try with the video.
yeah,
Is it okay if you just answer that question
sure,
again, if that's okay? Because you froze just after you
sure,
said absolutely.
yes.
Thank you, Jay.
Hmm. Absolutely. It's such a strong category of with families and anomalous experiences that my co-founder Stuart Davis, who is never shy to create a new phrase or neologism, calls it the genealogy of the strange. And we often talk about it in groups. It's often the case that we see it happening in lineages.
Uh-huh.
For example, my mother had an experience um, being floated out a window about 2 or 3 years before I was born, and has had other anomalous experiences with me as a child and outside of that. And there are other people in family groups that often it's interesting sometimes in like sibling situations, one sibling will have one or two modalities and another will have another entirely. So one sibling might have, say, hauntings and have seen a UFO, and another purely experiences the anomalous through precognition and, say, mediumship or something along those lines. And even that can cause friction and stigma within households because it's possible that the one sibling is afraid of saying the one thing to the other sibling and the other sibling. So people can go years, decades without even connecting those dots that 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 both have, each had experienced the anomalous in their own separate ways, right? Uh,
Yeah, yeah, because I can imagine for many people it can be very isolating, sometimes quite uncomfortable, sometimes terrifying, I imagine, depending on what the, experience is. It's not
abs
necessarily the case. I mean, that's the amazing thing about the group. It gives
mm,
people a space to try to talk about these things. And it must be just like even knowing having this group set up and everything to talk about it in itself is a thing, is a challenge.
it is. It is. And you know, it's we talk about it often. There are a lot of challenges in getting people to open up, and people have to open up in their own ways, on their own time scales. And so some people they come into the group and with, guns blazing and they just want to lay it all out as quickly as humanly possible. Other people come in and they just read posts and they may even attend a meeting with their camera off or something like that, and it may be 6 8 months and maybe even a year before you even hear a word out of them, and that's absolutely okay within the format that we've set up. We understand that a lot of people, there's a lot of processing, there's a lot of acclimation, there's a lot of digesting of what's happened to, themselves, and then also comparing with the experiences of other people. And that kind of processing can take a while. And it's absolutely okay to for somebody to join and just kind of sit back and absorb things for whatever length of time that they need to. And so it's interesting because the group, it often feels a little bit like a one-room schoolhouse in the general framework. And then when we have these kind of breakout Zoom groups, it gets a little bit more specific. And then it feels a little bit like what in the United States school system we'd call a pull-out program or something like that, where say like the gifted kids or the kids that are more inclined towards this or that kind of spend half the day over here and then come back to fourth grade or whatever, the general classroom altogether, right? Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, it's a fascinating thing, and I couldn't be happier to be such to be instrumental in it happening, for years. It's just the classic situation that often happens where, for years I thought to myself, why isn't there a community online for experiencers to talk to each other? Oh, protected, a place that was free of trolls, because I'm 43 years old. I grew up in a situation where, I saw places like Above Top Secret and Project Avalon and a lot of these kind of bulletin board sites in the early internet that where there were tons of trolls all the time, and threads would just get derailed within hours of very serious conversations coming up. And I would still, stomach those these sites and these threads just because I wanted the information, like a lot of people did, right? And then eventually I just recognized, like so many people do, you recognize something that's necessary in the world and eventually recognize that you're the person that apparently needs to do it, right? And so that's what we did.
That's fantastic. And in that light, perfect segue. I should be a radio DJ. In that light, you've recognized a way of doing a conference, and I know that you've been working with James on this. A
That's
way
right.
like thinking, like really deeply thinking about, you know, I think you've mentioned in the past that there's a kind of dearth of conferences in New York, but also how would you do a conference? How would you structure it? How would you bring people together where, it's paying respect to the vastness of, the phenomena? Um, so there we are. That was a good
That's
question,
right.
wasn't it? But
Yes,
it was a good
absolutely.
question up until the point where I said that was a good question. But so
No,
yeah, so
yeah,
tell us about. So this is. Let me just do the public service bit. Now there's a link in the
sure.
episode description. So we're talking about this 1 day conference that's coming up this Saturday, the 8th of October. It starts at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. So for people in the UK, that's 7:30 British Summer Time. And you work out if you're not listening, if you listen somewhere else, work out, please. Um, so this is an inquiry into anomalous experiences and the phenomenon, and that you've still got virtual tickets that are, up for
That's right.
sale. So I'll put a
Yes.
link to that in the episode description. And I've got my ticket. I was saying just a moment ago, I'm really looking forward to. Yeah, I can't wait. I'm really looking forward to it. So before we go and delve into who's speaking, let's talk a little bit about, because you were at Rice for the Archives of the Impossible. Is that right? Yeah,
That's right. Yeah, I was. And in fact, um, I flew into town. I flew into Houston. Rice University is in Houston, Texas. And I flew into town not knowing that the first morning that I woke up in Houston, that Dr. Jeff Kripal, who runs the gym program down there and organized the Archives of the Impossible, he's also the Associate Dean of Humanities down there. Um, Jeff asked me to speak at the conference, and I woke up at 6:45 in the morning in Houston, Texas, in a hotel, and discovered that I was on the bill all of a sudden, which was a
fantastic.
magnificent. It was fantastic. It was a dream. It was a dream that I didn't even know could come true in many ways, and it was exhilarating and just a little bit anxiety producing at the same time. And I'm so glad that it happened. The conference in general, it felt like I was in a version of anomalous heaven, you
Yeah,
know. It felt like I was in a version of anomalous heaven because of all the figures that were there.
yeah. It was. I mean, I've obviously watched the videos online, and it was some um, roster of speakers there, wasn't it? But did that directly influence you? Think, if I were to do this or this type of thing, how would that look? Speak a little bit about, please, how you arranged and started thinking about the
Uh,
conference that you're doing.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, thank you. Yes, that is a great observation. In fact, we very much James Iandoli and I very much patterned it a bit off of the Archives of the Impossible conference and just that kind of format in general. Um, in terms specifically in terms of the casting a wide net with who we were going to bring in to speak. Um, Again, it kind of goes along very well with the ethos behind the experiencer group and behind James's channel and his podcast, Engaging the Phenomenon, his research. We became friends partially because we're both researchers that live here in the New York City area, and also because we have so much in common in terms of how we look at anomalous experience, how we look at the phenomenon, and he's similar to me in terms of wanting to have a wider tent, to cast a wider net with regard to these topics, and to not box ourselves into one particular way of thinking or one particular modality when it comes to trying to understand these great mysteries that ultimately point to what is the fundamental nature of reality, and where are we, and what else is out there. So so we started talking, James and I, back in about January of this year. We started having dinner together about once per month, and we kind of jokingly and somewhat seriously started calling it UFO Supper Club. Um,
Yeah,
Partially in a facetious way because we're not only interested in UFOs, and that was a little bit of the end joke there. But also, it was just a way for us to get together and recognizing that um, often, this is a hub where we live in a hub where a place that people often visit town, and that we could organize dinners based around when prominent researchers and friends of ours came into town. And so we started doing that. And then after a few of those, we recognized, gosh, we could probably organize a whole event and invite the public based off of who might be coming into town. And so that's kind of where we're at. And so we saw an opportunity. We knew we had James had been talking to Gary Nolan and recognized that Gary was going to be in town for a brief window in October, partially because he grew up in Connecticut and he was going to visit family just north of the city. And he had about 48 hours that he could come into the city. And so we capitalized on that immediately and said, "Hey, Gary, why don't you come into Manhattan? We can put something together."
yeah,
And that was kind of the start of how we put this event together, and it will probably become a pattern because this is not going to be just a singular event. It's going to reoccur.
yeah.
So,
That's fantastic news.
so that's yeah, so that's where we started with it, and then from there, knowing that we had that central piece of the puzzle, Gary, we started kind of building around that, and so, um, I'm sure as we go on here, we can talk about the other folks that
Yeah,
him and
totally.
the other
Yeah,
folks that we brought in here. Yeah.
yeah, totally. So, but it's nice to hear that it came from those, dinner discussions, the supper club. I never realized that because I knew those were happening. I'm very generous. Sorry, very jealous of those happening. But yeah, it's
Well,
of course like
you have an open invite anytime you're over here, or when if we make it over there to the UK, maybe
absolutely.
we can establish,
Yeah, you can go to London. If you
the
ever come to London, we'll do it in London, absolutely. But
we'll
I've
have
never been to
yes.
New York, even though, I could talk a lot about New York. We're not going to do that now, but I've always wanted to go to New York. Um, right, so yeah, the speakers. So let's start with Tim Grieve Carlson. Uh,
Uh
yeah,
mhm. Sure. Tim Grieve Carlson is an absolutely incredible human being. I love Timothy Grieve Carlson. Um, I met Tim actually at the Archives of the Impossible conference. Tim Tim Grieve Carlson is now assistant professor in the Department of Religion and Philosophy at Westminster College in New Wilmington, Pennsylvania. He
uh,
earned his PhD just earlier this year, in religious studies from Rice under Jeff in 2022. And he actually worked on the Archives of the Impossible project himself. And so he was actually a key figure in organizing both the conference, and he was actually one of Jeff's kind of star students that was instrumental in organizing the archives themselves. So, for example, Tim is one of the only people on Earth that knows what's in Jacques Vallée's kind of hidden archive at Rice, which is due to become public in, I think, 2027 or 2028. Um, and so Tim helped organize and file that stuff away, archive that, and archive many other things involving, Whitley Strieber's
yeah,
memoirs and letters to him and many other things that are down there. And he has he's finished a book, and it'll be coming out soon. And this is going to be kind of his first talk in relation to his book. And his book project is partially about kind of the history of anomalous experiences that were encountered by early American settlers. Um, and there's apparently a very, very rich history of that happening, and it's really gone largely unexplored. And so he's kind of occupying this really interesting space where he's looking at um, kind of ecology and situations where anomalous phenomena has happened near sites of ecological importance, and also historical frameworks for how anomalous experiences were kind of translated or understood over the early centuries of North American life, essentially.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so his talk is going to be a bit about that and kind of a contemporary lens for looking back at these situations.
So he's a researcher, and he is a
Oh boy,
doctor
is
as
he ever.
well. So
He
so
sure
he's got
is.
his PhD. I should have said Dr. Tim Grieve Carlson. Sorry, Dr. Carlson. Um,
Yes, I'm not sure if he could resuscitate somebody on a plane. Maybe he could. But yes, I like to refer to him certainly as Dr. Tim Grieve Carlson.
yeah.
Yes, for sure. Yeah.
And so the research you've been doing in terms of the settlers' experience, would that have been letters, that they would have written to people, or how was that? How do we know about it essentially? What's the kind
Oh,
of
yeah, I mean, I think we may have to wait for his lecture
right,
to really hear about that. Because I'm not entirely sure.
right, yeah.
He's been pretty secretive about his book manuscript.
Oh,
His book is
really?
called it's called he just announced the title just a few days ago. It's called Contact Zone: Supernature and Culture in the Big Thicket, which I think is a wonderful and woolly title.
Yeah,
So
totally.
I'm very
Yeah.
much right.
So is the
So
big thicket like a place? I suppose it must be a place.
I
I'm not
mean
sure. We've got a lot of
I
questions
mean
for Tim.
it might be a mental place. It might be it might be a subtle realm as far
Yeah,
as I
maybe.
know.
Yeah, yeah.
As far as I
Certainly kind
know
of
at this point.
evokes some images in my mind, those three words put together, the big thicket.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, that's fantastic. So, yeah, I look forward to that a lot. And then we've got another speaker, Darren, who has recently kind of publicized or publicly came out as Darren. We know him in the UFO world as Exo Academian. And I'm a fan of his podcast, his incredible podcast, Point of Conversion. So, we know of his work a little bit. I imagine quite a lot of the people who listen to this podcast know Darren's work a little bit. So yeah,
Hmm.
can you just explain Darren's
Sure.
involvement, and thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, Darren, uh, also known and formerly known as Exo Academian. His work includes the Point of Convergence podcast, as you said, which addresses the kind of overlapping nature of the questions: who are we? Who are these others that people see? And what is the nature of reality? Those are kind of his essential questions. He also co-hosts Liminal Frames, with a guy named Nathan, who's a very good friend of mine who lives down near him. Um, and which delves into related matters, including the intersection of the UFO phenomenon and religious history, because that's
Yeah,
kind of the framework that they both come from. And Darren's a fantastically interesting person. Is he he's very meticulous about his podcast episodes. He really swings for the fences and kind of trying to tackle the big issues. you know uh, there are people that spend their whole careers just looking at kind of what might be one or two episodes of topical matter for his show. On one, he just might go into what are ultra terrestrials, and
yeah,
um
yeah, yeah,
and just try to do his best at laying all that out in 60 to 80 minutes, right? And so this is actually going to be his first public talk, his first in-person public talk, in at least in this realm, with regard to anomalous experiences. He's given one other private talk at the Monroe Institute earlier this year for kind of a private invite-only conference that they did, um, with regard to contact modalities, kind of HEIS, CE5 protocols, things like that. And he gave a talk there, to I think 19 or 20 other people or something like that. And so this is going to be the first opportunity for people to see him kind of in all three dimensions doing his thing. And
yeah,
we couldn't
yeah,
be more excited. It's going to be
yeah.
awesome.
And it is fantastic. Meticulous is the word, isn't it? They're so
Yes.
beautifully constructed. He's a very, very good writer, and it's so beautifully constructed arguments, and the kind of passageway through the field that he's exploring on each of his episodes. It's just, yeah, I mean, it's the opposite of me, basically. Like very well
That's not
constructed
true
and
at all.
thought through. No, but I mean, mine just kind of whatever comes to my head, basically. But that's really interesting because is it that an interview with James where he spoke about the Monroe Institute and he spoke about Chris Bledsoe being there. Is that, do you remember that?
Yes, that's right. And actually the first time that he both gave his name and that he showed his face was
Yeah,
on James's Engaging the Phenomenon channel,
that's
just
right.
some months back, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I'll put a link up to
Yeah.
that. I just remind myself to put a link up to that episode because that was a
Yes.
really excellent episode where he talks about the Monroe Institute and his experience there. He like went for like a
Yeah.
couple of days, as far as I can remember. And
That's right. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, a lot of luminaries there, a lot of really brilliant researchers, most of whom, if not all, had had their own contact experience.
yeah,
And so there was a lot of kind of lab study and conversations and lectures and going out into the field, and doing their own protocols. It sounds like it was a really fascinating experience for a lot of people. And Darren's had a lot of kind of eye-opening and interesting things to say about it in private. And I look forward to the lecture, and I think he's going to be talking a little bit about the Monroe Institute private conference, but he's also going to be talking about um, his own contact experiences, some of which have been kind of closely guarded by him, understandably, um, for most of his life, right?
Right.
So, yeah.
Okay. That sounds very, very interesting. And now we're going to talk about the work of Dr. Sean Aisborn Argans. Um, and he's really interesting because he runs PhD courses essentially, and MA courses on anomalous experiences and anomalous studies.
That's
Can you
right.
talk a little bit about what Dr. Sean Aisborn Argans is going to be bringing?
Sure. Yeah, Dr. Sean Naisbian Hargens, he's Dean of Integral Education and Integral Noetic Sciences, Program Director at the California Institute for Human Science. Among other concentrations, he oversees this incredible new MA PhD program focusing on anomalous studies, as you said. And this is, there are only a few people in the United States anyway that have this kind of heft and have been trailblazers in this way. There are people that are kind of their own islands, like Gary Nolan, right? And then there are people like Jeff Kripal and Sean that that have become kind of program directors or run a whole department. And I think as we move into the future, this is going to become more prevalent and even more necessary to have happening, because as
Mm,
Jeff puts it, these programs like this become kind of this academic shield for students coming into programs like this. People that are fascinated, people, brilliant minds need often these kinds of academic shelters, these academic shields, to be able to really pursue these fields in a serious way, and Sean has just started this new PhD program within this last year and a half. He has students. I've been a student of his for, gosh, about a year and a half now. And in his Exo Studies online course, which was kind of where he started workshopping a lot of the curriculum that he was going to be using in his MA and PhD program. And it's been very illuminating for me. His classes are brilliant. He has a really wide-ranging purview. He did this great paper that I think a lot of your listeners would love, called Our Wild Cosmos. And in it, he takes a broad approach and he does a survey of anomalous experience and researchers, and kind of comes up with a general taxonomy of non-human intelligences and non-human entities, and is very, very brave about kind of going in and looking at commonalities and differences. I think a lot of people, there's the wastebasket problem within anomalous study, where people want to say, the phenomenon, and or act like it's all one thing, right? Where there's probably some overlapping thing where it all comes together. And perhaps maybe it does, right? Perhaps it does. And at the same time, we see certain characteristics and certain scenarios that might lead us to the eventual conclusion that we could be dealing with like a whole New York City phone book's worth of different entities, different beings, and whole different uh, types of consciousness than what we're used to in our day-to-day life. And so we need people like Sean Napier and Hargens to be able to kind of light the path, to be able to actually look and create these kinds of taxonomies, at least as a starting place. And what I love about him is that he has a phrase that he often uses, which is take it seriously, but hold it lightly. He's not afraid to be wrong, and he actually kind of loves being wrong. And I really deeply appreciate the bravery that it takes to go for the discourse in that kind of a format.
mm,
And so he really looks at the social sciences. He looks at the history of anthropology. He looks at the history of psychiatry. He looks at the and he looks at all of these different kind of the noetic sciences and the social sciences in general and tries to bring them together in a really interesting way. And he's going to be making some interesting announcements about some upcoming projects that he has in the works, some upcoming book projects, as well as some um, well, I don't want to spoil anything, but he has some really exciting things in the works
yeah,
that he's ready to announce in terms of some new and really exciting academic studies that are going to be happening over the next years with regard to anomalous phenomena. So looking forward to that.
fantastic. And another speaker is Mitch Horowitz.
Oh,
Mitch
what?
Mitch Horowitz.
Yes.
He I saw an interview with him. I think it was James again. James is getting
Mm.
a lot of plugs there. That's just to say, by the way, engaging with phenomenon is like unbelievably brilliant, isn't it? I mean, it's really brilliant, that show. Um, but
It is.
it's really interesting from my point of view, okay? Because, you know, there are some things, some areas that I think, okay, we've got enough now. We've got like, for instance, with NDEs, for me personally, I think there's so much data out there, so much, like a vast, tens of thousands of testimonies, so many bits and bits of data that makes me draw the conclusion that there's something in it. Something happens after you die. Okay,
I agree.
and
I agree.
yeah, and you agree. And
Yes, absolutely.
yeah, and I know about NDEs. That's something that I've kind of researched in depth. ESP not so much, but Mitch Horowitz, he says that we're there with the ESP. He's talking about 80 years of research. You know, we've got to kind of move on now. We've really now just say, okay, that's it. We've got that sorted now. Now what are we going to do with this information?
Absolutely. That's absolutely right. He's Mitch is he's a PIN award-winning historian. His books include Occult America and Daydream Believer, which just came out earlier this year. He's written for the New York Times, he's written for the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Time, Politico. And yes, earlier this year, he did an amazing lecture that he's written up called ESP Case Closed, which is an absolutely wonderful talk
Yeah,
where he addresses exactly that where he looks at the academic history of ESP studies with, say, J.B. Rhine and the Princeton Anomalous Research the PAIR program at Princeton, other programs like that, and really looking at and saying, if this was anything else, at all, we would admit that this is the case. Things are so statistically off of the norm that
mm,
this has to be, this isn't an anomaly anymore. This is the norm.
mm, mm,
And so this is the first talk that he's going to be giving where he kind of steps beyond that and kind of he'll establish that again very quickly and kind of move into, well, what do we do now? What do we do now, and what do we do in the future with regard to ESP studies? And I couldn't be more excited because again, he's a fantastic speaker. He speaks sometimes in the ufological space. People have seen him on, say, the History Channel shows like Ancient Aliens. He's appeared on a few times, things like that. And so, he's very well versed within that field. He's very well versed in the esoteric in general, and he's one of the most eloquent speakers that you can find these days. And he's especially passionate about ESP studies and the occult in general. And so I look forward to hearing what he has to say. And I think for those that haven't really heard Mitch speak on these topics, it's going to be a really, really exciting talk for sure,
Yeah,
and it'll help build that bigger tent that we were talking about within anomalous studies,
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I think when I began this in the first episode of this
some of
podcast.
these people, a lot of the people attending, kind of,
Oh, sorry, I was just speaking over you because I think you glitched just then, Jay.
oh, that's okay.
Are you
Yeah,
back?
go ahead. Yeah, I'm back. Sorry about that.
That's
Sorry.
okay. I was just saying, when I began this like podcast last year, I think I certainly thought it. I hope I did say it, but if I didn't say it then, I'll say it now. We're so young and we're so naive as a species, you know. And the problem is we think we know it all, you know, and we don't know anything. You know, it's a kind of funny mix where we're like, oh yeah, we've got it all sorted. And then, you know, you think we keep going back to, um, you know, not us, obviously, we do accept it, but,
Hmm.
you know, kind of society as a whole keeps going back to not accepting the things that are just kind of outside of our framework a little bit, you know. And the great thing about Mitch's speech, you know, talk, it sounds like, is that, you know, at last somebody is saying, right, okay, let's put a lid on this. And now where do we go? You know? And then that's where it starts to get exciting. Do you know what I mean? Like
Absolutely.
speaking about this bloody thing, like 80 years, you know? Okay, fine, put a lid on it. And then, you know, let's see where we can go with it, you know? So that sounds
Absolutely.
fantastic. I'm really looking forward to to his talk. And then obviously now we need to address the keynote, I suppose. I'm not sure if this is the title you're giving them, but certainly the
Sure.
kind of most prominent of the speakers. I think it's fair to say, Dr. Gary Nolan.
Yeah.
Um, can you speak a little bit about? So James knows Gary, is that right? And you spoke about how there's this 48-hour period that he realized he's going to have a break at last, and then you contacted him
Yes.
and said, "How about doing this?"
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And yeah, Gary, we knew that Gary was going to be coming into town, that we had a very brief window where we'd have him, or that it would be possible for him to do something, and we kind of organized the whole thing around his availability this time around. And I'm so glad that we did, because Gary, this has been a huge year, in terms
Absolutely.
of mainstream acceptance of anomalous phenomena in general. And Gary Nolan is an instrumental part of that, and is only become more instrumental as the months have gone by this year. And I think we're going to see more and more of that in the years to come. And I think he just brings a lot. Dr. Nolan is the Ratchford and Carlotta Harris Professor in the Department of Pathology at Stanford University School of Medicine. He's published over 300 research articles. He's the holder of 40 U.S. patents and has been honored as one of the top 25 inventors at Stanford University. So he's kind of one of the most decorated and recognized scientists and inventors at one of the most illustrious institutions for science in our country.
Yeah.
And having him kind of come out as an anomalous experiencer, having him come out as somebody who studies this and really works on these issues is an incredible gift to the community at large. And he is so passionate about it. He's so driven, and he's not going to be stopping with this topic anytime soon.
Mhm.
And James introduced me to him, and I consider it an incredible honor just to know the guy. And I couldn't be happier that he's coming for this first conference of ours here in New York City.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm very much looking forward to hearing speak. He is, I mean, you know, he has had an incredible year, eh? Yeah, extraordinary man. And So that is, I just need to mention, you do have two co-hosts, don't you? You want to just mention who they are, please, Jay?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, we have Priscilla Stone, who's a friend of mine who does the Quantum Witch Cafe channel on YouTube. Priscilla is a fantastic and unique voice within the community. She's brilliant. She's wonderful. She does the Quantum Witch Cafe, and she also does UAP Book Club,
Yeah.
a monthly podcast, and I'm a regular panelist on there. And we've looked at the work of Diana Pasulka, and I think we've covered three of Jacques Vallée's books in this past year, and Timothy Good, and we there's our next one is going to be Project Beta by Greg Bishop. So
Uh,
we're very happy to get into the wonky weeds and the deep cuts of ufology on UAP Book Club, and it's a pleasure to be under her helm over there. And she's going to be one of our co-hosts. She just moved to Baltimore. She just moved to the East Coast, and so we're kind of capitalizing on her momentum of having just moved out to ask her to come up to do this. And then our other co-host is Kelly Chase of the UFO Rabbit Hole podcast, which is a newer podcast just in the last year. Kelly's been doing this, and she, like Darren, is very meticulous in kind of writing out and pre-producing her episodes. And she, like Darren, swings for the fences, and she's definitely her own person. But it's an apt comparison. If anybody's heard Point of Convergence, um, there's a lot that people could gain from looking. If you're a fan of Point of Convergence, you would probably be a fan of UFO Rabbit Hole. And if you're a fan of UFO Rabbit Hole, there's a good chance that you would like Point of Convergence as well. They're similarly well thought out, beautifully prepared, and brilliantly argued programs. And I can't wait to see Kelly in person for the very first time coming up this week. It's going to be awesome.
yeah. And I'll put links to those podcasts and, obviously the details of all of the speakers, etc., in the episode
Oh,
in the
excellent.
episode notes. So it's you've been busy. That is a quite a roster of speakers. How do you feel
Yeah.
like you've got a couple of days to go? How do you feel? Is it all coming together? Is it like are there loads of things to do? Or is it all more or less done? Or how's it going?
Well, it's a great question. Well, so almost exactly a week ago, I was on a plane back from Italy. And so I'd been very mid preparation, and I kind of left New York, New Jersey in with our condo in a complete state of disarray with papers everywhere, um, in terms of putting this together.
Yeah,
Both not just the experiencer group, keeping the experiencer group on track, and this conference and other things that will be coming up in the future even. Um, it's a lot to keep together. And for about 10 days there, I had a long planned trip to Europe with my partner. My partner's mother is about 77 years old. She's turning 78 later this month. And we had decided 3 years ago we were going to take her on her first trip to Europe. Right. And so in the middle of planning my first big conference, no pressure, in one of the most expensive cities in North America. And James and I are doing this without any sponsors, without any corporations behind us. We independently funded this thing. And so it was like not just kind of an interpersonal risk in some ways, but a huge financial risk, to be like renting an entire theater and all of the kind of regulations and things like that and tax that it takes to really put together an event in New York City. And then I just kind of had to like leave in the middle of these preparations and go off to Greece and Italy and shepherd around a 77-year-old lady on her first European adventure, right? And it was great. It was very rewarding and it was fun. and it was also, um, it was what it was. It was a beautiful family experience, but I had to kind of put a lot of things with regard to these projects on the back burner for a while. And
Yeah.
so there was this building palpable sense of anxiety while I was out there, walking the beautiful ancient streets of Athens and Siena and thinking, oh my God, my inbox is a tire fire right now. I'm sure of it. And then, I came back and it took about a week, but I feel right now pretty great about things. I'm really looking forward
Fantastic.
to the Saturday.
Yeah,
There's a couple little, dots on the I's and crossing of the T's that still need to happen,
of course,
but I
yeah.
think we're really, really in a good place for people to have a really brilliant, unique, and kind of a one of a kind experience here in New York and online for the people that are going to be joining us that way, for sure.
Absolutely. I'm really looking forward to it. I'm sure you will be able to, but I do very much hope that you spend time enjoying it, like on the day, as well as all of your responsibilities and, all of the hats that you're going to be wearing. Make sure that you just spend time enjoying it as well, Jay, because, you deserve,
Oh, thank you.
reap the rewards of everything that you've set up. So
Oh, I
just to
appreciate that.
Yeah, no worries. I can't wait for it. And I'm going to be tuning in 7:30 p.m. UK time. Well, it's 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It goes on till I don't quite can't, do you know the times off the top of your head? You're probably not sure when it
Oh,
ends, but
yes. It's going to be close to 6 hours, and so it's going to be a long night for you.
it will be.
And yes,
Good.
so
It's good that it's a Saturday. I don't need to get up for work the next day, so that's fine.
that's what we were hoping in EU members of the experiencer group. And so I'm really used to kind of setting up our times in such a way. I'm really used to setting up our times in such a way that it's okay for the West Coast of the US, and it
Yeah,
also works for the UK EU. So that's what we were really striving to do. And so,
fantastic. Yeah,
you might need to put a pot of tea on at some
yeah,
point,
yeah, yeah,
but
yeah,
I
yeah,
hope
yeah.
you can make it. Yeah.
That's interesting because I
Yeah.
did wonder that. I thought, oh, that's interesting. It's kind of starting quite early. So that's why. Well, thank you
Yeah,
very much for
absolutely.
thinking of us. That's really good. That's really
My
great.
pleasure.
Yeah, no, I mean,
My
I
pleasure. Yeah.
absolutely cannot wait. And I've really enjoyed, talking to you this evening. It's been it's been brilliant and finding out a bit more about the speakers that you've got lined up. Do you want to I'm just going to ask you to do that thing that every podcast asks you to do, Jay, which is, how can people get in contact with you? Obviously, the big thing that's coming up for you is Saturday, and we've covered that. I've got a link in the episode description to get your virtual tickets. But aside from that, how do people contact you? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. And so you'll have the link in the description. It's an inquiry into the anomalous.rsvpfi.com. And the online live stream tickets are only 30 US dollars. So we tried to price it as low as we possibly could. And I think you'll see when you compare it to other similar conferences in the space, it's quite the deal. And
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
people can also they can find me on Twitter at at JAYC King 78. A little bit wonky. You can find the Experiencer group on Twitter at symbol for experiencers, FOR experiencers. You can also find us on our website, which is routed through both www.forexperiencers.com as well as www.tegmembers.com. And you can always feel free through Twitter to DM me. I do whatever I can to respond to folks that get in touch with me that way. And there's also a contact window through the Experiencer group by which people can contact me at any point. And for anybody and anybody out there that is an anomalous experiencer that would like to join a community like the Experiencer Group, we do have a 2 month free trial, so you can see if you enjoy the Experiencer Group. And after that, it's actually we have a new policy of pay what you wish. So there's no financial barrier towards people being able to become a member of our community. And that's been a long goal. That's been a goal since the very beginning for us to be able to do that. And I'm happy that we're able to offer that to people now.
That's fantastic. That's really, really fantastic. Yeah, well, I mean, you know how much um, I value the group being out there for people that need to access it. I think it's absolutely fundamental in terms of giving people a space to discuss their experiences. So thank you for setting it up, and thank you for making it pay what you can. That's really that's amazing, Jay. That really is amazing. Thank you for doing that.
Well,
Um,
thank you.
yeah, no worries. So look, I'm going to say goodbye. Thank you very much, Jay, and look forward to Saturday.